Gonna welcome everybody. We are going to be learning about sustainable aviation fuels from some people I've gotten to work with, in particular Peter with Friends of the Mississippi River. I had shared with Peter while we were getting prepared here. One of the things I've really appreciated is their constructive engagement in policy debates here. And our state, we are in the center of the biofuel debates and policy, and we have a sustainable aviation fuel hub in the state. And so I've really appreciated how the Friends of the Mississippi River have gone about approaching these conversations. I think very aligned with CCL. I'm going to take a short introduction from the website just to introduce the group, and then I'm going to let Peter and Megan introduce themselves. But Peter leads Friend of the Mississippi River Agricultural's clean water advocacy efforts. He advocates policy reforms to integrate next-gen crops and cropping systems into the farming landscape. Long-term, these innovative crops and practices will improve the river's health while enhancing farm prosperity. So that sort of big picture systems view is taken by Friends of the Mississippi River. This is an introduction for me to Megan, so I was so happy. She's their relatively new biofuel policy manager. Is that right, Megan?
Yep, that's right.
Which is probably
Yeah.
a sign of the growing debate that a full-time job was created to help Peter and others in FMR who balance a lot of different topics. So I'm going to turn it over to Peter and Megan for our talk. And there will be plenty of time for questions too, especially if more people don't join. So this wasn't meant to be an hour-long conversation, but we'll have room for questions and conversation.
Great. Thanks a million, Greg. Hello, everybody. Again, I'm Peter LaFontaine. I'm the Ag Policy Manager here at Friends of the Mississippi River. Let me get my slideshow teed up for you. Okay, are folks seeing it in slideshow form?
Yes.
Okay. Actually, you know what, Megan, are you able to share? It might be easier so that I don't have to split screen this.
I think I can do that. I would probably also be screening it, or maybe I'm not sure what you mean.
Okay. I'll toggle back and forth. Let's see here. Slideshow again. All right. So we are here at FMR. We're a Twin Cities-based group that works primarily on water quality and ecosystem health of the Mississippi River in the Twin Cities region, which is a bit of a jump from water quality to transportation policy, particularly international transportation policy. All of this really does tie back to what happens on the landscape. Of course, you guys are familiar with a lot of these big trends in forestry and land use. And that's really playing out here in the Midwest as we transition as a society away from petroleum-based fuels and more toward biofuels, and eventually, hopefully, even more sustainable options. Those biofuels have a tremendous impact on our landscape, particularly here in the Corn Belt, where we are major producers of ethanol, soy biodiesel, and other energy crops. So those impacts on the landscape inevitably wound up ramifying to the river. Agriculture is the largest source of pollution to not just the metro Mississippi, but more or less the entire watershed all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And so keeping an eye on what we're growing on the landscape is really important and very impactful for our mission. I am going to turn this over to Megan for a quick a technical explanation of some of the issues behind sustainable aviation fuel, and then I'll take back over and we can dive into some of the advocacy issues. We'll leave plenty of time for conversation at the end, so hold on to those big questions, but if you need clarification or just want to pop in with a quick question, that's fine. Feel free to do so at any time. And I'm not sure we'll notice raised hands, so feel free to just jump in. No worries about stepping on our toes. With that, I think, Megan, I will turn it over to you.
Okay. I'm not seeing slides. Are you seeing slides?
No.
Ah, okay.
So when Peter changed there.
How's that?
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
All right.
Mhm.
Okay. So here in Minnesota, we are obviously a very highly agricultural state. Transportation is our single largest emitting sector at 25%, and that's followed closely by agriculture. And nationally, transportation makes up about 30% of our emissions, and 10% of that is from aviation. Globally, the aviation industry produces over 2% of all human-induced greenhouse gas emissions. And while that maybe doesn't sound like a lot, that is almost as much as the entire country of Brazil. Aviation biofuel policies are potentially a high leverage solution that can reduce emissions from both transportation and agriculture at the same time. Next slide, please. There we go. Okay, technical difficulties. We're getting it. So the vast majority of emissions from aviation, over 97% of the emissions from aviation come from the jet fuel alone. So if we want to address aviation emissions, we really have to be talking about the fuel. Next slide. And looking ahead, flight demand is expected to accelerate even further, along with any of the associated greenhouse gas emissions. So if nothing changes, emissions from aviation would more than double by 2050. And the industry is investing in newer fleets, new technology, operating efficiencies, but industry modeling is suggesting that those investments can at best only serve to slow the growth in emissions. If we want to achieve real emissions reductions, it has to come from the fuel. It's possible to use electric power for small planes, but electrifying long-haul commercial or freight flights is limited because, among other things, batteries are very heavy. So really the only way to get there, at least for the next many decades, is to use lower carbon fuels, and the aviation industry is betting big on sustainable aviation fuel being that solution. Sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, is a drop-in jet fuel replacement, meaning that it can be used in the planes that we already have. It undergoes extensive testing and controls to prove that it is equivalent to conventional jet fuel, and then it's blended 50-50 with petroleum-based jet fuel before being used. SAF can be made from a wide variety of input materials, or what we call feedstocks, and that includes crops such as corn, soy, winter annual oil seeds. It can include wood waste like dead trees or mill residues, fats and oils such as used cooking oil or rendered animal fats, and it can even use clean electricity and captured carbon. In order to qualify as sustainable aviation fuel, it needs to have at least a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to conventional jet fuel. And that's measured by something called this carbon intensity score, which is a really important criteria that we use to compare different types of SAF. The carbon intensity score measures all of the greenhouse gas emissions throughout the entire life cycle of the fuel. So that includes things like the fertilizer used to grow the crops, the fuel to power the tractor, transporting the crops to the processing plants, and also the chemical conversion process that produces that SAF. And this CI score is really important because there are state and federal tax credits for SAF producers, and these tax credits are based on this carbon intensity score. Like I mentioned on the last slide, SAF is required to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50%, and it has to meet this requirement in order to qualify for any of these tax credits. And the lower the CI score, the higher the tax credit. So the goal there is to try to incentivize the production of SAF with the lowest possible greenhouse gas emissions. There are 4 main chemical conversion processes or pathways that are used to produce SAF, and they all use different input materials or feedstocks to produce that SAF. The first is the alcohol to jet pathway, and this can use any type of alcohol as a feedstock, but in the US, this is mostly going to mean corn ethanol. The main benefit of this pathway is that we have a lot of corn and a lot of infrastructure around the ethanol industry, especially where we are here in the Midwest. But corn is a really input intensive crop, And partially because of that, it has a really high carbon intensity score, so it has really high greenhouse gas emissions. The second pathway is called HEFA, or hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids, and that can use fats and oils as the feedstock. And these can be things like soybean oil, used cooking oil, and winter annual oilseed crops like winter camelina and pennycress. Using soybeans for the HEFA process would have pretty similar outcomes to using corn for the alcohol to jet pathway. We have a lot of it, but a large expansion of soybeans would have some serious environmental impacts. If instead we were to use winter annual oilseeds, this provides low carbon intensity scores and some really strong environmental benefits that Peter is going to discuss more shortly. These last two pathways I'll go through quickly because their technology is less developed and they're not likely to be used for quite a few years, but they can have some really low carbon intensity scores. So the first is power to liquid, which uses renewable energy to convert captured carbon and water into a liquid fuel. And the second is gasification with Fischer-Tropsch, which can use a really wide variety of biological materials, including crop residues, forestry residues, and even municipal solid waste. We won't go into the chemistry of the different pathways today, but what's important to know is that the different pathways require their own processing and refining processes, and those processes require equipment that's specific to each pathway. So what that means is that choosing to invest in one of these pathways, such as building a production plant for corn-based alcohol to jet, means that we can't use that investment to produce SAF of a different kind, such as using winter annual oilseeds. And this is what people mean when they say, infrastructure is destiny. Building a SAF plant is very, very expensive. It costs between $1 and $5 billion. And so the choices we make now about which pathways to invest in will determine which pathways are the cheapest and the most likely to be used in the future. In 2021, the federal government launched the SAF Grand Challenge, which is a government-wide initiative with the goal of using SAF for all domestic flights by 2050. And the milestone goal for 2030 is to produce 3 billion gallons of SAF, but last year we produced less than 100 million in the entire year. Many airlines also have SAF targets, and some countries even have SAF mandates, such as in the European Union. Right now, we're at the very start of a new industry that is likely to scale really rapidly in the next few decades. SAF has the potential to be a really effective climate solution, but there are also risks and ways that SAF could have serious negative consequences on the environment. And with that, I will pass it back to Peter to dive into that more deeply.
Thanks, Megan. Folks, bear with me for just a sec while I figure out my screen. Let's see here. Okay, are you guys still seeing the slideshow?
We see a script.
Okay, great. Yeah, I give myself no grace when it comes to speaking off the cuff. So let's try to figure this out here. Stop share. I'm gonna share my presentation. How about now? What are you seeing?
We see slides.
Great.
I have one question for
Sure.
if that's
Sure.
Megan. So the ethanol that's produced, what is that then processed into to make SAF?
Yeah, so how that works is that basically you go from corn to ethanol, and then that ethanol goes through these additional kind of chemical conversion processes, and then it produces a fuel that is exactly like chemically equivalent to petroleum-based jet fuel. It just starts with corn instead of starting with oil. So it produces the same thing in the end, it's just kind of how it gets there.
So you would tie into existing oil plant infrastructure to take the ethanol for that final conversion, or do you have to build a new manufacturing plant to convert the ethanol into that?
Um, that is a more complicated question than you know. So for the most part, it is building a specific SAF plant. But there are technically some ways where you can do what's called co-processing, where you can use existing oil refineries to produce like 5% SAF as you do that, because the processes are quite similar. You can also like retrofit a retired oil refinery to produce SAF in a few of the different pathways. Um, all 4 of the pathways that we talked about have different equipment, different processing. And so like that works for some of them and not for others. And so they require quite different equipment and different ways of going about it.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, let's bring this back around to FMR's role in this, and particularly the emphasis on agriculture and water quality. Since, as Megan laid out, crop-based biofuels like ethanol are going to continue to dominate the SAF market in the early going. These are satellite images showing vegetative cover in Minnesota over the course of the year. And the vast majority, for those of you who don't know, of Minnesota's cropland is used to grow crops like corn and soybeans, which are planted in the spring and harvested in the fall. And because of their short growing season, the predominance of such summer annual crops means that soils are left mostly bare and exposed to the elements through the remainder of the fall, winter, and spring until crops are planted and begin to mature in late spring or early summer the following year. So we have this really big period of the calendar where most of Minnesota is just what we call the big brown spot. This is millions of acres of croplands that are devoid of living vegetation for months at a time, which leads to tremendous amounts of topsoil erosion, chemical runoff, and other processes that impair the river and the wider ecosystem. And it's essentially the same dynamic that created the Dust Bowl in the 30s. There is a growing consensus in the conservation community, the ag conservation community, that one of our best chances to avoid another Dust Bowl is to increase the amount of what we call continuous living cover. And this is just what it sounds like, keeping living plants on the farm landscape year round in order to approximate perennial natural systems like prairies. And farmers can do this by planting perennial crops or by creating more diverse rotations of winter and summer annual crops. It's no secret the US ag sector has lost a tremendous amount of crop diversity, particularly since the Reagan administration. And it's been a big challenge to reestablish value chains and farmer knowledge of practices other than commodity crops. But there are some really exciting new options that can help farmers achieve continuous living cover. Why do I have a blank slide here? There we go. So these are 2 examples of conventional versus continuous living cover systems. As you can see here on the top, that shows the difference between a fall tilled field and a field of Kernza perennial grain. Both of these are following a 1-inch rainfall. And you can just see the difference in loss of topsoil and what's not there on the left, plants that are not receiving water, that are not receiving sunlight early in the year. And then on the bottom, this is the difference between a tilled field in April and a field where a new crop called winter camelina was planted the previous fall. It overwintered and it's already completely covering the soil in the early spring. So you can see this is just really taking advantage of more of the productive months of the year than the systems that we've currently got in place, with all sorts of attendant environmental benefits. Winter camelina, like the field pennycress shown here, belongs to an emerging class of crops called winter hardy oilseeds that have tremendous potential to provide continuous living cover across millions of acres. And this is the scale we need to achieve our water quality goals. The reason they can scale is, among other things, because of the growing market demand for vegetable oils for things like sustainable aviation fuel. And I'll circle back to winter hardy oilseeds in a minute, but let's go back and talk about the elephant in the room first. This is apparently a real thing, a real public art dragon plane corn sculpture in Atlanta Airport. So I'm going to be using this on slideshows going forward, I think. As Megan mentioned, the single biggest feedstocks for sustainable aviation fuel will almost certainly be, at least in the short run, corn and soybeans. And as she mentioned, there are advantages. They're abundant, there's lots of existing infrastructure, it's reasonably cost effective over time, especially with the federal tax credits. But there are also serious drawbacks. Increasing demand for these crops will result in the conversion of more and increasingly marginal land to production. Increased cropland acreage will likely result in the loss of grasslands, wetlands, forests, conservation acres, and the biodiversity on all those lands. And let's put a fine point on that. The federal renewable fuel standard, which is essentially our national ethanol policy, already requires the US to consume 15 billion gallons of ethanol in our gasoline each year. Producing that ethanol consumes about 36 million acres of cropland and has been shown to be a primary driver of cropland intensification, as well as things like economic consolidation that have really severe environmental and social consequences. And then let's translate that to SAF. So it takes about almost 2 gallons of ethanol to make a gallon of SAF. If we'll just do a thought experiment here, if in 2050 we were to get all 35 billion gallons of SAF from ethanol to meet the grand vision, we won't, but again, just a thought experiment. It would require more than a four-fold increase in ethanol production. So even at a 50% petroleum, 50% ethanol blend rate in that 35 billion gallons, that's still requiring somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 million acres of corn at current production levels, or almost all of the acres in the US currently planted to corn. So the point here is simply that a corn ethanol dominated alcohol to jet pathway represents a potential ecological problem with massive landscape conversion to annual row crops. And again, all those attendant problems, runoff, aquifer depletion, agricultural climate emissions, similar dynamics play out for soybeans. So this could be a really, really big deal, really bad deal for the environment. In contrast, winter annual oilseeds, which Megan covered a little bit earlier, are a much better option because of their lower carbon intensity, water quality benefits. They've been shown to reduce nitrate leaching by almost 97%. And because they don't incentivize land use change, both here in the United States and elsewhere, particularly in the tropics, because they use the same acre as the summer crop. So you don't have to pick or choose. You get to do both if you're a farmer. We're at the very early stages of commercialization of these crops, and it will be years before they're a viable alternative. But in our view, no other option has such a positive environmental profile and the potential to scale in the medium term, at least before we achieve things like green hydrogen or truly carbon-free or carbon neutral aviation. And so my colleagues and I are working closely with researchers at the University of Minnesota and industry partners, including folks at Greg's old haunts at Cargill, to speed up the commercialization cycle. And I want to be clear, this is not just an enviro pipe dream. There's beginning to be real money and corporate heft behind winter hardy oilseeds. Those of you from our region might be aware of the effort to develop a Minnesota SAF hub, which is essentially a public-private business consortium that aims to make Minnesota or Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport into a major driver of SAF production. FMR is working closely with partners in the conservation community to push the SAF hub leadership, which includes Delta and Cargill, to abide by a core set of environmental principles. I'll make sure to drop the link to those principles in the chat when I'm done. But one of them is to make substantial investments in winter hardy oilseeds. The SAF hub is on record, and I quote saying, "Environment outcomes are the purpose of the SAF solution, and this decarbonization solution must take clean water and biodiversity into account." We're engaging with SAF hub leadership to hold them to that rhetoric and have slowly been getting buy-in. I think there's a lot of excitement about the potential for winter oilseeds, but there's also perhaps some people realize that what we have now is corn and soy, and they're being realistic about that. Before I wrap up, I need to say that we are fully aware of the potential for greenwashing in this space. Almost all the big power players, farm groups, the biofuel industry, the airlines themselves, they want a system where the state and federal tax credits are as easy to obtain as possible. In fact, the previous administration, the current administration, and Congress have already taken steps to undermine the scientific integrity of the process and distort the fundamental goal of minimizing emissions. We're increasingly concerned at FMR that the S, sustainable, in SAF might just become a marketing label rather than being truly tied to sustainable practices. And we're working hard to elevate these concerns at the same time as we drive development of the winter hardy oil seeds. It's been a really tight needle to thread. Our power as conservation advocates, such as it is, I think is largely tied to our ability to shape the public conversation. And biofuels have proven to be a really hard thing over time to communicate and organize around. They're really complicated. The science is not always crystal clear, and there is just a tremendous amount of politics on both sides. But particularly, again, those power players that will benefit from the tax credits, they've got a little bit more power than Friends of the Mississippi River. So we're up against some big forces here, but we do see solutions. We are trying to make those solutions as accessible and widespread as possible. It's not the work of just a couple of years, though. This is going to be a decades-long transition, and we hope to get it off on the right foot. So I think I'll probably close there. We can open it up to Q&A or clarifying discussion. But yeah, who wants to kick us off?
I'd like to jump in if I may.
Please.
Okay, I'm Michael Slattery. I farm about 20 miles south of Green Bay, Wisconsin, okay? And grew up on an Iowa farm. Ethanol is not the driver in the production of corn, okay? What drove ethanol is we're overproducing everything. We're overproducing corn, we're overproducing soybeans, we're overproducing wheat, and there are no other markets that have demand for other types of crops, okay? So that's the first point that we have to understand. The second is we're in the business of farming to also earn a livelihood as well as to conserve our environment, and we're trying to find that balance. And what will be required if our row crops are used for the production of SAF, three things are going to be required. The first of which is you have to be planting cover crops. The second of which is no-till, so you're not tilling your land. And the third is primarily, as was indicated, it was called fertilizer, but it's actually the issue of nitrogen because except for 4 plants today, your nitrogen is synthetic nitrogen, which 40% of the input is natural gas in order to create that, okay? So we have to use nitrogen inhibitors, which is intelligent to use because you don't want nitrification, you don't want leaching. So those are the 3 requirements that in all probability, if whatever type of row crop is being used, that will be required, okay? And do you get green throughout the year? Yes and no. So, I mean, you got the green there, but is that absorbing is that absorbing carbon dioxide out of the air in cold winters? No, it is not. The other point I'd like to make is that I did plant camelina this year as a cover crop, okay? Mm-hmm. And it was an absolute failure. And I question whether camelina can work in these northern climes. When I looked at the seed advertising on it, it should have worked, but it did not work on my farm. So I think that is important. The other issue is and I have a question on this. I mean, these oil seed crops, if you take like your perennial wheat, Kernza, okay, there's no economics in it. I mean, the University of Wisconsin has had test plots up here in Door County for quite a few years now, and the most they're able to generate from it is 17 bushel of Kernza per crop. I mean, this is a niche market, so that is not going to induce farmers to go into that, particularly because we can't earn a living at that. Anyway, I guess those are the main points that I wanted to say. Whether these other oil-based crops can be used or not, I guess this is the last question I have is, so when I think of biodiesel, the problems I have in using biodiesel is that it gels in the winter. So how you're going, and I don't know, I mean, maybe there's a chemical solution to this, but how you're going to use this oil-based crop when it gels so easily and these planes are flying so high in the air that they're up to minus 45, minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, you know, is that going to gel on them? I don't know. So those are just a few comments. Thank you.
And
Thanks for those.
And Michael, let me just jump in because you were sharing your perspective, which is great. Was there a question there though? Because ultimately, biodiesel isn't jet fuel, and it's not sustainable aviation fuel. So I have a background as a chemical engineer, and those are different. And so, yes, those have been issues with all diesels. There's a reason plugs are here in Minnesota long ago. But was there a question? And it's great to hear you. And I think it's important to understand the Forever Green program, which Peter and Megan have talked about, is there specifically to help with the commercialization of these crops. And it's not easy. And that's why we have to have the field work done to figure it out in the long term, to figure out how to scale it. But I just want to make sure, was there a question there?
I don't have a question. I just wanted to raise points of concern that I had, and I thank you for the explanation on the biodiesel compared to oil crops being used to make SAF.
Yeah, thanks a million, Michael. Those are very important comments and insights. We at FMR are not farmers. We recognize that, you know, largely the agricultural economy has sort of forced farmers into a pretty narrow band of options, whether that's the way that we administer the safety net programs like crop insurance, or where the markets are. As you pointed out, if there's not a demand for a perennial grain or for a winter oil seed, farmers aren't going to plant it. That's just common sense. The dynamics between grains and oil seeds are pretty different, and I do want to focus on the oil seeds because they are you know, really targeted toward the bioenergy side of things. A couple of sort of direct responses here. You mentioned that you had a crop failure with your camelina. I'm sorry to hear that. It's unfortunately at this point, you know, that is still an issue that some farmers are facing. The research, breeding and genetics and agronomics haven't really gotten to the point of you know, being a consistently viable crop. Like I said, we're at the very early stages of breeding these crops. These are, in the case of pennycress, this was a weed that was domesticated only about 10 years ago. In the case of camelina, it's been around as a summer and spring crop for thousands of years, but developing winter hardy traits has been something that's really only happened over the last, again, decade or so. And fortunately, the way that the research is going, that development timeline that before took decades or hundreds or thousands of years in the case of previous crops, that's really been sped up with technological developments and investment. But we are careful to say that this is not a crop that farmers can plant now and expect 100% success rate with. But we do need to invest in research, breeding, agronomics to make sure that within a decade or so that this is something that farmers can utilize. The other piece of that is the market side. So there are two things that you need for a market. You need supply and demand. There is huge demand. There's basically bottomless demand right now around the world for vegetable oils. Whether or not camelina can meet the standards of the market right now, maybe not, but the demand's there. So we need to make sure that the supply can ramp up to meet it. I think that's probably I'll stop there. Again, totally valid arguments. We're trying to be careful not to say this is ready to go. And experiences like yours are really important to inform how things go forward.
And I would just add on the sustainability practices that you mentioned. First of all, my dad is from Neenah, and my grandma grew up on a farm in Door County, so not too far away from you. That we didn't really get into this today, but the federal tax credit did change starting January 15th, I think. So in the previous tax credit, you were required to have cover crops, no-till, and enhanced efficiency nitrogen fertilizer, because corn ethanol turned into SAF on its own does not meet the requirement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50%. So you have to do these other things, such as sustainability practices. There's also an option to do like on-site renewable energy generation at an ethanol facility or at a SAF plant in order to meet that minimum requirement. And the sustainability practices are one method that isn't like officially required, but is pretty much required unless you want to do a lot of on-site renewable energy or carbon capture. When the tax credit changed starting this year, that process kind of changed. So it's no longer a bundle of those sustainability practices, and they haven't fully come out with the guidance on how those practices, those on-farm practices, are going to funnel into the carbon intensity score or into the tax credit. So you are correct, and a lot of it has become very up in the air over the last few months. And that is in part because of the new administration, but it's also in part because the tax credits that were approved during the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, the first one went through the end of 2024 and the new one started in 2025. So this was kind of the plan from the beginning, and we're just in this weird middle stage where it's still a little bit uncertain how these numbers are going to all fit together.
All right, we'll take a question from Luke and then we'll go to John next.
Hi, I'm Luke. I know very little about farming, so my apologies for all of that. I'm from Dallas and I'm in Boston now at Harvard. I was wondering, with this very, it seems like corn and soy based biofuel tradition that we have, in this country in the last few decades, and kind of, the immense requirement for land use and land consumption, with developing these types of biofuels. What it looks like in terms of transitioning to more like sustainable biofuel with now an administration that's like very resistant, to sustainability and more inclined to preserve, the establishment that wants to keep the system the way it is, all the polluters and so on. Thank you.
Great question. Very active question that's being asked right now. I would say the short answer is we don't know yet. There are proposals to change the tax credit that is the federal tax credit that is currently active, that started in 2025. It's called the 45Z tax credit, which is named after the specific part of the IRS code. And one of the aspects of the carbon intensity score is something called ILUC, or indirect land use change. And that is attempting to basically measure if we are using land for crops for fuel, that isn't being used for something else. So corn, soy, these row crops are given an ILUC score that factors into the carbon intensity. Things like these winter annual oil seeds that do not use additional land, those don't have that score. If we use forestry waste, those don't have an ILUC penalty. This new proposal this year, which was started by Amy Klobuchar, who is our Democratic senator, would remove the ILUC score from this 45Z. And that's something that we have huge concerns about because, yes, because it, it messes with the science in general. You're bringing politics into science. And it really kind of artificially allows corn and soy and other row crops to have a much lower carbon intensity score to calculate the tax credit than they have in reality. So this is something that we are really against and that we are strongly advocating against, but it is kind of rolling out right now. Peter and I just spoke with Klobuchar's office 2 weeks ago. And so it's something that's still being debated, but it's something we're quite worried about. Yeah, and that would, be very accurate to say at that point that it would be easy to call sustainable aviation fuel some greenwashing. Yeah.
So Megan, I did post a couple of links in the chat for the broader audience, one on the bipartisan bills introduced or the letter, and also an opposing view from Yale, which gets into the indirect land use change, just if people want to dive deeper into either of those topics, because this is from a congressional efforts, this is one which is bipartisan and has support in both the House and the Senate in terms of what's being proposed. So thank you, Luke. John?
Yeah, I got sort of a short-term and long-term questions. You mentioned short-term, looks like ethanol will be a primary feedstock, and that's mainly driven by corn. And I'm just curious, cover crops in this area are increasingly being used. No-till in this area, we're in the driftless region. It's very hilly. You're kind of a dummy if you're not no-tilling. And I know the flats of Minnesota, a lot of people don't use those techniques. So is there a push to really get farmers to adopt conservation practices to support that short-term reality that ethanol will be used? Secondly, on the longer term, you mentioned that we might be years, maybe even decades away from commercializing. I wonder if you could speak to what's the primary blockade or obstacle that is, if the demand is there for these types of oils, what's the main technological issue to be overcome to be able to produce them at scale with all the benefits they could provide?
Yeah, two great questions, John. I, recognizing that Michael is, at least one of the farmers in the room, I would welcome his input as well about the conservation practice question. My sort of computer jockey read on the situation is, there have been major pushes over the years to incentivize conservation in farming. The Sustainable Ag movement is largely built on trying to get more public support for things like no-till, cover cropping, various other cost share practices that can result in positive environmental outcomes. At least here in the upper Midwest, let's just take cover cropping as an example. In Minnesota, we've only got about a 4% cover crop adoption rate. It's, among the lowest in the country, but generally, the farther north that you go, the harder it is to incorporate cover crops into a rotation just because of the short growing season. Um, Things like winter rye, which are traditionally used as cover crops, are terrific. Like they have, very positive environmental benefits. If you are running um, a farm where you have livestock that you can graze on the rye, you're in good shape. But as the industry has shifted toward consolidated operations, both for livestock and row crops, and focusing on the main commodity crops, that sort of diverse economic system, has been lost to a large degree. Um, our premise for why winter camelina or field pennycress can take off, even though cover crops, traditional cover crops haven't, is that they provide that profit motive for farmers. When we can get the genetics to the point where they are truly winter hardy and farmers can grow them profitably, and again, we're not there yet, but when we reach that point, and the researchers that we work with are pretty confident that that's around the corner, the idea is you're no longer asking a farmer to cost share a cover crop uh, system. These things are anywhere from, 35 to 55 bucks an acre just to sow cover crops that you then don't have a market for. Um, Even if we subsidize that at, heroic rates, most farmers just aren't going to take that deal because it costs them money in the short term, and farmers operate on, pretty thin margins. Hard to look 3 or 5 years ahead when your loan has come due. Camelina, pennycress, on the other hand, they've got an immediate market outlet. Farmers can make a profit on that crop just as they would a summer annual.
So just let me interrupt. Sorry.
No,
Thanks for.
please.
How would it work? You keep calling it a winter crop. What is it a perennial, and do farmers grow it through the summer as well, or are they growing corn in the summer and then they're planting the penny?
Yeah, I mean, terrific question. Sorry for not getting into the technicalities earlier. So, um, let's sort of go through the the year here. So, say a farmer has planted a short season summer crop, silage corn. They harvest that silage corn late in summer, early autumn. They then plant winter camelina. The winter camelina emerges in October, early November, provided there's not a frost out, and sort of produces a little rosette of leaves on the ground. So it's not a big plant. It's just, basically ground cover at this point. It goes dormant when the cold sets in, and stays alive through the winter under the snow. It's not growing through the snow. It's not doing anything at the time, but it's just sort of hanging out. And then in the early spring, before farmers have planted their crop, camelina will come up. It'll bolt. It'll send up a big flower head, produce oil seeds, and this is where it starts to get a little bit more complicated. As that crop is growing, farmers can come through with their planter and plant in a crop like soybeans while the camelina is growing. So we call it a relay system. You're handing off from the camelina to the soy. Both start to grow. Well, yeah, the camelina by this point has gotten kind of large. Both are starting to grow. The soy is kind of lagging behind where it normally would be, but the camelina is doing great. Farmer comes through, harvests the camelina over the top, leaving the soybeans unscathed. And that opens up the canopy so that the soybeans can then get all of that sunlight, the rain. Uh, they grow as normal. There's a bit of what's called a yield drag, which impacts the soy harvest, but it's our men are working on it to minimize that. And then you harvest the soy as you would in the fall and start all over again. So it's a more complicated system. The management intensity is higher, but you are more productive on the same acre of land. These systems, again, are complicated. I'd be interested to hear at a later point from Michael about what his experience was. But that's the 101. And then your second question, the primary barrier to why it's not here yet. I mean, again, Michael's experience is instructive. The crops are not at this point 100% reliable. They're early in their domestication. Farmers aren't familiar with them, and there are real kinks to be worked out. But the trajectories all point in the direction of commercial viability within a decade or so.
And I think the other thing is that like the SAF industry hasn't developed yet.
Yeah.
There was the first flight that left MSP using SAF was in September of this past year. And that did use winter camelina that was grown in Minnesota and North Dakota. But there's not a plant in Minnesota yet. So they grew the winter camelina in Minnesota, put it on a train, sent it to Montana Renewables. They turned it into SAF and then shipped it back. And so I think what we really want is for winter camelina and the SAF industry to be able to scale together so that when we are producing SAF and when we're starting this industry, it's using these really sustainable feedstocks. So we're getting into a bit of a chicken and egg scenario where winter camelina is not there yet because SAF's not there yet. And so, really trying to make sure that we are scaling this from the get-go in a sustainable way.
Peter, may I jump back in, please?
Of course.
Okay, I mean, you mentioned my name a couple of times, so the conservation issue, okay? Conservation issue is a big thing. So nationally, it is estimated there's only about 5% of your arable land that is cover cropped and probably about 15% on average that uses no-till, okay? This is conservation practices. It differs by region, it differs by state, right? I think we're a little bit better off here in Wisconsin than you are in Minnesota from what you just said, that you only got 4% in cover crop. But under the Trump administration, which is totally undermining anything having to do with conservation, anything having to do with global warming, climate change. I mean, under the IRA, you had climate smart commodity grants, et cetera, just totally gutted by the Republicans in the House, as well as they'll be gutted by the Republicans in the Senate as well. But this issue of, so to say, taking virgin ground and turning it into a row crop, we saw that did happen after 2012 when, due to the tremendous droughts in the Midwest, your markets went way high and people did go in and convert conservation, what I want to say, CRP ground
CRP.
into some cropland, okay? The government can, although I do not expect the Republican administration or the Trump administration to do it, but and it already exists, that if you take CRP land out and you turn it into a row crop, you cannot get crop insurance on that. So the government does have ways in order to regulate that you are not taking marginal land out of its present status and putting it into row crop. As for the cover crops, as if I can get your name right, Megan indicated, the infrastructure is the big problem for everything. So, I mean, I would like to grow different crops here. I grow 4 different crops, okay? But I would like to grow different crops, but we don't have the infrastructure for it. I lose all my money in the shipping. So, I mean, there's no financial incentive. Again, we're trying to earn a living at this. There's no financial incentive to do it, largely because of your freight cost. Then as far as, I mean, my own practice, and it depends on timing. And oh yeah, the Amy Klobuchar comment. So what is behind that? What is behind that is that there are two things. One is the overproduction that we have of corn because it's going into ethanol, okay? And the ethanol, roughly 33% of the corn grown in this country is into ethanol, 8% is into distillers grains, and then you have roughly 10% of the corn going into other things like corn oil or corn sweeteners or carbon dioxide and 2 or 3 other things, okay? So that is definitely a driver now. But with EVs coming online, again, this is the economics for farming. With EVs coming online, and all your major car companies in Europe, in the U.S., in Japan, in South Korea, and China, they have made an investment into this. You know, the demand for ethanol in automobiles is going to be significantly reduced. So if we don't get sustainable aviation fuel as a means where we can grow crops for this, you will have tremendous bankruptcies in the farm community, particularly in the Midwest. All right, so then how do what is the best way to do that? At least we as a farmer, how are we looking at it? Is we need to, because your ethanol plants are not going to be able to sequester the carbon there. Some of them are, but they're very few. So the formula, which you correctly indicated, that changed in 2025, will require that you do have these 3 practices, you know, of cover crop, no-till, and nitrogen inhibitors required. But that's sort of a no-brainer. You know, how do we get further along there? And the planting of the cover crops, because we cannot plant them after we get through harvesting corn for grain. I mean, if you do, yeah, I can go in and I'm planting rye after that, but it hardly gets any height on it, which means that there's very little carbon dioxide, which is being taken out of the air and being sequestered in the spring, you know, before you go to plant into it. So, I mean, these are some of the farm issues that we're dealing with, and we're trying to support the environment and improve the environment and be conscientious stewards of the land. That's what we're trying to do. Thank you.
And with that, I want to thank our speakers, Peter and Megan, for leading us through a great conversation here. So thank you both. I'll also reflect, because our discussion has really pointed out, and John, in the chat, if you're looking, I did pull a picture from FMR talking about what Peter was covering, just giving some pictures at different points in the growing season on what this looks like. And if you're curious, that Forever Green website has additional information too, but if you wanted to picture that. But, one of the things I would share is we're talking about systems, and each system itself is pretty complex. But in this conversation, we're dealing with ag systems and food systems and fuel systems, and then laying climate and energy, and we're kind of looking at the nexus for a solution. And as Peter and Megan pointed out at the start, it's a challenging solution. What's going to be the solution for aviation as we decarbonize at the speed and scale needed here? And sustainable aviation fuels are the promising answer, but there's a lot more legwork and research and trials, and there's going to be failures, but we have to make the economics work at scale. Yeah. Peter, Megan, anything to close and wish us some good thoughts on here?
Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate the conversation. Thanks for that good summary, Greg. I think, just to close us out, there are very legitimate reasons to support biofuels from an economic perspective. I don't think that's necessarily the conversation that we're having now. It's more about how to keep sustainability the core focus of sustainable aviation fuel policy. As a climate solution, we want to make sure that this is an accurate representation of what the science actually says. We would welcome further conversation with this group about advocacy strategies, technical strategies, commercialization strategies. So feel free to reach out to us at any time. I think Greg or Nancy can probably share our info with you. And yeah, thanks again for humoring us and welcoming us to your group.
Yeah, thank you
Thanks,
so much
all,
for
and
having us.
yeah, and spot on discussion linking the sustainable aviation fuel agriculture. We really appreciate your breadth of knowledge across these complex topics.
Thanks a
You bet.
lot. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks,
Thank you.
folks.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.
Hey, Nancy, and anything else?
Not that I can think of, but
Good.
oh, he's gone now, but thanks to the farmer too, who gave us his perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's very interesting. I had no idea about a lot of this.
It inevitably turns from a 101 into a 202. It's hard
It is
to
very hard
describe
to
in
stay at
layman's
a
terms.
101 level.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you didn't.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
Yeah, thanks
Peter,
again.
Yeah,
you
thanks
going to
again.
the MEP event on next week on the 16th or not?
I hope to. There's a field tour that I might decide to go to instead, depending on the weather.
Well, the field tour sounds more interesting,
Yeah.
but I got to try to go there.